Okay, I think we're at time, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Aditya Ranganath. I'm a data librarian at the Center for Research Data and Digital Scholarship at the University of Colorado Boulder Libraries. I'm going to be presenting on the topic of enabling open science through persistent identifiers for research instruments and facilities, and would like to thank all of you for taking the time to attend the presentation. The presentation is based on work that's been carried out by the FAIR Instruments and Facilities Research Coordination Network, of which I'm a member. The project has been funded by grant awards from the NSF's Fair and Open Science program, the FAIROS program. I'm also joined by two of my colleagues on the grant project, Matt Mayernick and Andrew Johnson, and I think I also saw Matthew Murray on the attendee list. Matt and Andrew are both PIs on the project. Matthew Murray is a fellow data librarian at CU Boulder Libraries and is also a project member. And they'll help facilitate some of the discussion that we hope to have towards the end of the presentation. So I'm going to speak for about 15, 20 minutes to just introduce you to the project, and then we hope to open it up for a broader discussion after that. So before proceeding, I just want to talk a little bit more about the project's core personnel. The FAIR Instruments and Facilities Project is a multi-institution collaboration between the National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR, Florida State University, the University of Colorado Boulder, and Stanford. Renee and Julian is at Florida State, and Claudius Mundoma is at Stanford. In addition to Matt, whom I've already introduced, Greg Sossmeister is at NCAR. And I've also introduced Matthew Murray, who's at CU Boulder. I also think it's worth emphasizing that a lot of people are involved with the project beyond the core personnel, including an advisory board, which you can learn more about on the project website. More generally, I think the goal of the project is to sort of develop a community of practice around the topic of facilitating reproducible and open science by assigning persistent identifiers to facilities and instruments, and to bring various stakeholders together to explore these issues. And many of these stakeholders have contributed their insights to the project, for instance, at a workshop that we convened at the University of Colorado earlier in the fall. So I also want to acknowledge their contributions and also invite all of you to join our ongoing conversation about PIDs, research instruments, and reproducible science later in the presentation and beyond that as well. You can find more information about joining our various communications channels on our website. So as I've already mentioned, the broad goal of the project is to create and sustain a community of practice, or more formally, a research coordination network that brings together various stakeholders in the open science movement to explore how we can systematically assign persistent identifiers to research instruments and facilities, and thereby encourage the citation of those crucial resources in the research literature. More specifically, our goal is for the network to collectively document use cases for how and why PIDs can be assigned to facilities and instruments, and pool together expertise to provide concrete recommendations to various open science communities and stakeholders about how they can help to advance the goal of systematically cataloging, documenting, and citing research instruments and facilities. So before proceeding, I think it might be worth defining some key terms so that everybody has some clarity on what exactly we're talking about. So first, a persistent identifier in conceptual terms is essentially a digital identifier that has certain core properties, such as being globally unique, persistent or stable over time, and machine resolvable or processable. There's also a metadata schema that's associated with persistent identifiers. There are many ways in actual practice to set up a persistent digital identifier, and some practical instances of persistent identifiers that you may be familiar with and that meet these criteria are research resource identifiers and dataset DOIs. Research resource identifiers, or RRIDs for short, are basically ID numbers assigned to research resources like antibodies, model organisms, or software, and that these RRIDs essentially facilitate methodological transparency in research practices, especially in the biomedical research literature. Dataset DOIs are a different system of persistent identifiers that offer persistent identifiers in the form of links to research materials. It's important to emphasize that there are a lot of different persistent identifier frameworks in use today, and thinking about how some of those different frameworks could be adapted to the context of instruments and facilities is a challenge. It's also not yet clear whether an entirely new PID framework might be needed for instruments and facilities. So moving on, we can define an instrument as a device used for making measurements alone or in conjunction with one or more supplementary devices. Instruments may have configurations, settings, or subcomponents that change over time. They can also vary greatly in size and complexity. So an example of an instrument might be a microscope or a LiDAR sensor. We can think of facilities as being somewhat broader and more encompassing than instruments, in that facilities also encompass personnel and may be tied to a specific location. So for example, a biotechnology laboratory would be considered a facility, while an instrument might be a microscope within that laboratory. I think these definitions can hopefully clarify what we're trying to do through our research coordination network. Essentially, our goal is to find a systematic way to assign persistent identifiers to research instruments and facilities so that those instruments and facilities can be more systematically cited, documented, and tracked in the scientific community and in the published literature. At the moment, PIDs are consistently assigned to things like published papers, datasets, and software. And what we're trying to do is essentially to expand the PID universe to include research instruments and facilities. I think these definitions also point to some of the complexities involved in this task, which underscores why discussion and information sharing through a research coordination network is so important and valuable. So for example, how can a persistent identifier account for changes in instrument configurations or subcomponents? At what point do changes in an instrument accumulate to the point that it's a different instrument entirely? What might the implications of those changes be for the persistent identifier that's attached to an instrument? To take another issue, there are potential complexities in thinking about the relevant units of analysis for purposes of citation. So for example, if a microscope from a lab is used to produce a published research result, what should be cited in the relevant paper? Should the microscope be cited using its persistent identifier, or should the broader lab facility be cited? Or should both be cited? There aren't clear-cut answers to those questions, which is why I think the Research Coordination Network is an important opportunity to think about them in a systematic way. Given the focus of this conference, I think it's worth being explicit about the various reasons why assigning persistent identifiers to research instruments and facilities advances the cause of open science. And I think there are many possible reasons. So for example, assigning PIDs to facilities and instruments would allow those resources to be more easily tracked and cited, which I think would increase research transparency and facilitate reproducibility. For example, if a scientist is trying to reproduce the work of another scientist, but they find that they're having trouble, they could easily use the persistent identifiers associated with the instruments in the original study to assess whether the different results are due to subtle instrumental differences used in the different studies. I think it's also worth noting that this transparency can facilitate equity in the open research ecosystem. For example, assigning PIDs to facilities and instruments might make it easier for researchers from under-resourced institutions to discover and identify the instruments they need and find ways to access those instruments for their own work. In other words, assigning PIDs to instruments and facilities could lead to a more efficient allocation and use of capital-intensive resources across the research ecosystem, which is something that everybody benefits from, but which might be especially beneficial for researchers from smaller and less wealthy institutions. I think this provides sort of a visual representation of what we're trying to achieve through the Research Coordination Network. As you can see, there are a lot of different stakeholders that play a variety of different roles and offer different services that are relevant to the goal of systematically assigning PIDs to research instruments and facilities. And all of these stakeholders are connected to each other in complex and interdependent ways. And what we're trying to do in the project is to kind of illuminate and map out this network and direct it towards the task of expanding the PID ecosystem to encompass instruments and facilities. I think the discussion so far might have felt a little bit abstract at times, so it could be useful to briefly highlight some actual projects at some of our team members' institutions that do assign PIDs to instruments and facilities. So here's an example of an application at Stanford that allows researchers to use RRIDs that are attached to campus instruments so that they can discover facilities and instruments that are relevant to their work. At CU Boulder, the Alpine supercomputer run by our research computing team uses instrument DOIs, as does the integrated surface flux system at NCAR. It's worth noting that at CU Boulder, our core facilities team also uses RRIDs to track instruments. So even within CU Boulder, there's sort of two different instrument PID systems that are operating concurrently. And when you zoom out from our specific institutions, I think the existence of multiple PID systems and use cases creates a lot of complexity that we're hoping the Research Coordination Network can help to sort out and make sense of. So at this point, we've completed a full year of the project and are into our second year. During the first year of the project, we created a solid groundwork for future efforts. So we developed a project website that we hope will serve as a focal point for our coordination efforts. We also started identifying relevant stakeholders, projects, information, and resources. And we also presented on the topic of PIDs for research instruments and facilities at a variety of conference venues. The capstone of the first year was an in-person workshop that we hosted at CU Boulder. It included 35 participants from a variety of organizations and disciplines. So we had a really nice cross-section of the various stakeholders whose work is relevant to the assignment of PIDs to instruments and facilities. The workshop consisted of several presentations and breakout sessions that allowed us to kind of map out the lay of the land in this space and identify next steps for the Research Coordination Network. In the workshop report, we distilled these discussions into several observations that are going to guide our future work. I'd encourage you to read the published report where we go into more detail. But I'll quickly walk through some of our observations so that you can get a sense of where we're headed. So the first observation, based on our discussions with stakeholders at the workshop, is that there is in fact a need to assign PIDs to research instruments in order to foster the goals and values of open science. That was our intuition when we proposed and started this project, but we believe that the discussions at the workshop with this broader community validated that initial intuition. The second observation is something that I've already alluded to, which is that there are a lot of different PID systems in use today, and different PID systems are already being applied to instruments and facilities. So we really need to get a better handle on the infrastructure behind these different systems and to understand which systems are best suited to instrument facilities use cases. That said, even though figuring out the relative strengths and weaknesses of different PID systems is important, it's more important to lower the barriers to adopting PID systems in the first place and to encourage their use and to communicate their value. So an important goal for the Research Coordination Network going forward is to develop guidance on adoption and how to lower the barriers to PID system use in the context of instruments and facilities. Another important observation is that we don't want to exclusively focus on PIDs, which might not be sufficient on their own to facilitate the tracking and citation of instruments and facilities. Metadata is also really important, and we want to think about metadata related to instruments and facilities might be connected to instrument PIDs and to broader project metadata to facilitate discovery and transparency. I alluded to granularity and evolution challenges earlier. So those challenges refer to the fact that instruments evolve over time and might have parts switched out or significant configuration changes. And that makes the task of assigning PIDs to instruments and facilities especially complicated. And we need to do more to understand those challenges in different disciplinary contexts so that we can develop useful guidelines. As a starting point, I think a good rule of thumb that we sort of agreed on is that we need to start with simple use cases to fix our intuition, and then move on to more complicated use cases and more guidelines for those more complex instances. We also observed that instrument and facility providers face significant resource constraints and limitations that make assigning PIDs to instruments and facilities challenging, even if it's something that they want to do. So an important next step for the project is to gather more data from those providers and identify ways in which some of these resource constraints could be alleviated. Even though the value of assigning PIDs to instruments and facilities was clear to workshop participants, we agreed that there's also a need for concerted efforts to convince the broader scientific community of the value of citing instrument and facilities PIDs in research products. So for example, it's really important to convince researchers and PIs of the value of citing instrument PIDs in their published work. So to that end, our project aims to create value statements that explicitly make the case that assigning and citing PIDs for research instruments has the potential to ensure that research data is, quote, born fair, and that research results are reproducible and credible. And finally, an important observation from the workshop is that we currently lack an incentive structure to encourage the assignment and citation of instrument PIDs. And so we need to think about how to introduce relevant incentives into the system. We kind of need to map out the stakeholders that are involved and what their needs are, and think about how to make sure that their incentives are aligned with the broader goal of assigning and citing instrument PIDs. So as I've kind of emphasized, this project is very social in nature. It's about gathering a community together to discuss some of the issues that I've introduced. So we'd love to hear from you and continue the discussion beyond this presentation. There's more information on this website about getting involved and signing up for project communications. I also want to mention that our next workshop is at Florida State University in summer 2024. Details will be coming out soon about that. So please do check out the website and get involved. But for purposes of today, we would like to use this opportunity to gather some insights from all of you about your experience with PIDs, with facilities and instruments, about your experience with these resources and some of the challenges that I might have alluded to. So these are the questions that I'd like us to think about. Matt, do you think you'd like to do breakout rooms or have this discussion in this bigger room? Do you have a sense of what would be useful?
So can you hear me okay?
I can't hear you.
All right. So thanks, Dee, for going through the presentation.
I think at this point, maybe we'd open it up first for just questions or immediate follow-up from any of you on what Adi just presented. Any kind of initial responses or questions about the presentation of the project.
Another thought that I had is I can
show a few more examples. I think I wanted to demonstrate a little more what Adi was talking about in terms of just the diversity of the sort of situation, kind of the on the ground, so to speak, reality, which is sort of what motivated this project at the beginning. So I'm going to go through a few examples kind of in line with what Adi showed. So let me know if you're not seeing my screen, but this is the website for one of the NCAR facilities that, as Adi mentioned, we've assigned PID to. This actually is an airplane or an airplane platform that provides capabilities for the atmospheric science community to do a variety of airborne field collection processes for hurricanes, tornadoes, and various other atmospheric phenomena. And this is the website for it, and with various pieces of information. At the bottom, we have a recommended citation, which includes the DOI and sort of a syntax for that. And this was a bit of an experiment when we first started this about 10 years ago. I'm just going to copy that for a second. We weren't quite sure how this was going to work. And we've assigned DOIs to about 25 kind of facilities like this or instrumentation pieces like this, as well as a couple of computing facilities, like Adi mentioned, at the University of Colorado. And we are getting some use of this and some citation to this. But what's interesting is it is still a bit varied. So this is a paper that has cited this here. You can see they used our recommended citation or pretty close to it anyway, and have it referenced here like this. But it's also still the case that we see references like this kind of in the middle of the text. And this DOI link is going through a proxy server. That's why it looks strange, not like a typical DOI URL, but that's just because that's sort of an artifact of the proxy. So I think one of the things that we're still observing here is that even though we're getting increased use and we're able to find things like this, it's still quite variable in terms of how it shows up. And as Adi mentioned, there's multiple types of identifiers that are being used for this purpose. So that was DOIs. This is RRID, which is the Research Resource ID. So this is the Animal Imaging Shared Resource Facility that's managed by the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. And there's quite a few different RRIDs, Research Resource IDs, that the University of Colorado has assigned. And RRIDs are a different type of identifier. They don't resolve directly to a page like this, like DOIs do. They resolve to a metadata page essentially hosted by the SciCrunch facility. And so, as you can see from that same identifier here, there's a variety of types of metadata about that facility. And so this is sort of a different approach to using our PIDs. It's a different type of system. It's got different metadata. It's got different services associated with it. It is also being used in literature. So here's that animal image resource RRID mentioned in the text here in this paper, recent paper. And you can actually see a few other RRIDs here for various resources. This is a cancer research journal. This is actually a mouse strain. So this mouse strain has a RRID, and I think it's mentioned again down here. And so in a lot of ways, I've been working in the DOI and sort of data citation world for a long time. We're kind of in a similar sort of state where maybe data citation was 10 to 15 years ago, where there's sort of starting to be some use of identifiers for these resources, but they're quite variable in terms of how they're being used, what types of identifiers are being used, how they're resolved, what metadata is associated with them, and so on. And so I think in a lot of ways, that's why we sort of have the discussion sort of focused around sort of your use of identifiers in general. I'll stop my screen share there now. And I think we're interested in kind of your experiences with PIDs in general and how within whether it's data citation or other types of work, PIDs have become more used. Yes, I see Howard has a comment, a question.
Hi, this is Howard Ratner, the Executive Director of Chorus. Matt, we've met before.
Yes.
So I've also been involved with a whole bunch of those various different persistent identifiers. I'm really interested in what you have to say here because it coordinates with work that we're already doing and have done with DOE labs and now with CSIRO on user facilities, sometimes called research resources. And I'd love to coordinate more. I think it's interesting because we thought a natural fit would be ORCID, and that's being used for the DOE labs. CSIRO in particular didn't want to use that methodology. They prefer to use the funder ID system, which you might argue is an imperfect system. But it's actually proving to be an easier path to getting into the published work because publishers already have a system for dealing with funder IDs. So sometimes you got to take the easier road rather than the harder road just to make things happen. But I think there's some obvious synergies here between what we're doing and what you're doing. So I'd love to carry on that conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Howard. We'd definitely be happy to have more engagement with you and your efforts there. We have had some engagement with federal facilities. Some of the folks from a couple of the federal agencies attended our workshops, and we've done a few focus groups, as Adi mentioned in his slides. So we're definitely interested in that. We're also connected into one of the coordination groups for federal facilities called CI Compass. Maybe that's just NSF facilities, but to try to connect in there and see what PID interests there are. One of the things that we observed, as Adi mentioned, is there's a variety of use cases that are of interest. And I think the types of IDs being used are sort of variable based on those use cases. And that's citation, for example, versus reproducibility is quite different use cases. And can be some fairly different needs for PIDs. So I guess a question that I would have maybe open for anyone who's here is, what interests you might have around this topic, or what challenges you might be encountering in assigning PIDs, either for instruments or for any other type of resource. Jump in first. No challenges at all? We're also interested in hearing about what you're currently doing with PIDs, if you're assigning them to data sets, software, kind of how you're approaching PID assignment in general. See a few items in the chat here from Howard around different work. Yeah, we are aware that there's an effort. This is a good point to bring up, that there's multiple efforts around the world actually on this specific topic. So Howard mentions in the chat CSIRO in Australia. There's an Australian interest group for PIDs for instruments and facilities. We're coordinating with that group. There's also a group in Europe, which has gone under the PID-INST, which stands for PIDs for Instrumentation working group. They developed a nice metadata kind of recommendation around PIDs for instruments that we're pushing forward and coordinating with. I see Christopher has a comment. Yeah, Christopher.
No, thanks for really nice summaries and presentations on the project, and congratulations on the FAIROS Award. A number of years ago, and I think Howard would remember this, there was quite a bit of conversation about PIDs for physical samples, and that's sort of ongoing and in development, of course. But there's a related stream of ideas in the museum collections world, and I'm wondering if you had thought about generalities for from physical sample PIDs to working with the museum collections community on assigning or issuing PIDs for materials collections in these institutions. And so over.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I do think there are some commonalities in almost any sort of attempt to assign PIDs. One being, what is it that you're identifying? Kind of the basic, unit of analysis is often kind of a challenge. And I'm sure it manifests differently for different things. In the case of data sets, it was, sort of what are the kind of contents of your data set? Can you define that consistently? I think with the instrumentation thing, this comes up with, as Dee was mentioning, when is an instrument a new instrument, or how much does it change in order to be a new instrument? Or if you sort of swap in a component, is that important to keep track of? It's usually important to keep track of from a metadata point of view, but does that have any impact on your PIDs? And so I imagine that there's sort of a similar question there about, the level of granularity of samples. And, if you have a bunch of, minerals in a collection, do you assign an ID to sort of the collection as a whole, or sort of subcomponents, or for each item that you have? I think this gets back to the use case kind of question of, what are you trying to do with these identifiers? If your goal is sort of an inventory of everything you have, then yeah, you need to assign an ID to every sort of piece of your collection. If your goal is, sort of an impact analysis, well, maybe you don't need to know, which specific item was being referenced. It's sort of broadly speaking, how is this sort of collection of things, used, and what's the impact of that as a whole? So I think that the use case has a big impact on kind of approaches to assigning PIDs. I think the last thing that I'll mention here is that within the geosciences, the physical sample IDs started out as IGSNs, International Geosample Numbers, and that was one of the items on one of the charts that Adi mentioned. And that started out as an independent, kind of its own system. And a few years ago, migrated to be part of a DataSite DOI kind of infrastructure. So it's still kind of its own part of DataSite DOIs, but essentially all IGSNs are now sort of a flavor of DOI. And so I think there's sort of an interesting, sort of network level discussion and sort of sets of discussions being had around a lot of these topics of how many ID systems do we need? How do they connect to each other? How do they relate to each other? Do we need more for specific types of things as they come up? If you have a new type of resource like an instrument you want to assign an ID to, do we need a new type of ID for that, or can we use DOIs or other existing identifiers? So I think the growth and the need for the growth of the ID landscape is still an open kind of question that's being discussed. So those are some thoughts in relation to your questions, Christopher.
I think also like the facility definition we have is pretty broad. Like Matt mentioned, like airplanes as one type of facility. And so that's one area where there could definitely be overlap as well in regards to tracking physical objects or locations with physical objects.
Yeah, exactly. Diversity of things underneath one label. Howard, you want to comment again?
Yeah, so I wanted to comment on the facilities comment. Yeah, so for the CSIRO thing, we're seeing that exact thing. So we are, the first two facilities that we'll be tracking are the Australian Telescope and their marine, I think they call them, damn it, I can't remember. It's their marine vessels. So it's their ships and submarines and things like that. So I agree. They are not always the same thing for sure, because the DOE labs and their plasma facilities and hadron colliders are very different from the telescopes. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and as I showed with the RRID example I brought up, mouse strain. I mean, that's a very, very small, specific thing. So there's a pretty wide range of activities encompassed under this sort of set of things, which is kind of how this project came to be. So at NCAR, we've assigned DOIs to these fairly large things, and at CU they'd kind of gone about it in a different way. And so we initially started talking about this topic and realized we were interested in the same topics, but going about it fairly differently. And so we kind of decided to use that as a excuse to do some coordination around this. Yeah, Martin.
I Hey, Matt, it's been a minute since we've last spoken, and I can't remember if we talked about this or not, but I'm prompted to ask this question by some of Chris's questions about samples. This is about alternatives to the DOI, notably ARKs for samples that a lot of I know, especially cultural memory organizations use as an alternative because they have, for various reasons, they're a little bit cheaper to implement in some cases. And I'm just curious if, as you've gotten more into the work of the RCN, if you have any thoughts on that, or because I continue to wonder about that and to what extent we should think about ARKs in addition to DOIs.
Yeah, we're looking at ARKs as well, which is Arkable Resource Key, for those of you who aren't familiar with that. We actually use ARKs at NCAR for a different purpose, as a persistent identifier within our digital repository for sort of general repository digital content. And like you said, they have some different characteristics and capabilities. So as Adi mentioned in his slides, we are kind of starting a sort of comparison activity to map out the differences and relative functionalities of these systems in some more detail, so we can kind of have some more concrete responses to that. But I think what I want to go back to the use case kind of comment that I made earlier, which is that if your use case is really fine-grained tracking, then something that scales with the number of something that has costs that scales with the number of IDs that you need to assign, which is how DOIs work, probably is not the way you want to go. And so that's, I think, where ARKs are getting a lot of uses in the cultural heritage section for, persistent identifiers for, hundreds, thousands, or millions of objects at a really fine grain of granularity. Whereas DOIs are generally, although there's some organizations that have millions of DOIs, certainly in the dataset world, it tends to be assigned at a higher level of granularity. And that's certainly how we're using them for facilities as well, is we're not using DOIs to track, thousands of instruments that we might have, sensors and very sort of micro things. So ARKs have a different financial model, which is that you can set up your own ARK server, you can run them yourselves. And so they have a sort of a scalability at cost that might be conducive to sort of use cases that require fine-grained tracking. RRIDs are sort of in the middle ground, where they are being assigned to very micro things, but at a sort of level of abstraction where, as I showed in that example, they're assigned to a strain of mice, but not necessarily the shipment of mice that I acquired in my laboratory last week, right? So they're not being assigned to every single sort of instantiation of a microscope that might be purchased in a commodity sense. So they're more us being assigned at a kind of a model level, if that makes sense, not a instance level. And I think there's some opportunity to kind of use these identifiers in complementary ways, where they're sort of higher level identifiers that might be assigned to more abstract things or higher levels, and then other ones that are assigned to more specific levels of granularity. So I think that's a lot of sort of speculation in terms of them working together, but I think that's where we're interested in seeing if that can work out.
I think that makes a lot of sense, Matt. Thank you for those observations, and I hope it's sort of a parallel or embedded thing, but I love your comments about the different scenarios and situations where you might use that, because you're absolutely right. The two types of PIDs lend themselves to different kinds of scenarios. Thank you for the comment.
And I was also just going to add, and hi, Martin, nice to see you, and thank you for the question. Kind of related to the granularity question there, or directly related to the granularity of like higher level and micro level, finer grain things. But are the services, we've talked a bit about this within our project, are the services that are built around specific PID systems. And the thing about DOIs is that because they came out of the publishing world, a lot of the infrastructure and services around that revolve around tracking them in publications. And they're well equipped to do those kinds of things. And DataCite has continued that with data sets, right? A lot of the services they're developing are all about tracking citation of data sets and relationships between published outputs and things like that. Again, if that's the use case, right? If your use case is about tracking impact, particularly in publications, which is definitely something we're hearing from a lot of facility operators, then there's an advantage to DOIs versus, ARKs perhaps in that case. And in some disciplines, RRIDs, where they have strong relationships with publishers and they're, having policies developed for how to cite those in publications, then maybe RRIDs give you the advantage there. But that's definitely not consistent across disciplines from what we've seen. So I just wanted to throw that in too.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. There's definitely community dynamics here of use of these types of identifiers, and the RRID, the syntax of RRID. I'll just stick one in the chat again in case you kind of forgot what those look like, but is similar to sort of a traditional. That's just an example. Oops, sorry. I think I sent that to one person specific. There we go. It's a consistent, that syntax is consistent with traditional identifiers for things in biomedical databases, have existed for a while. So they resolve in a similar way as other types of biomedical database identifiers. So like Andrew said, that's sort of being consistent with traditions is sort of conducive to having them being embedded in other parts of the publishing workflow. Whereas other fields that don't have sort of a typical syntax of identifiers, something like a DOI or an ARK, where it's sort of more generic, can be conducive to that. I think the metadata requirements, as Adi mentioned in one of his slides, or the metadata characteristics is also an important point of distinction, where DOIs, again, there's multiple flavors of DOIs. It's important to emphasize that. But they, cross-ref DOIs versus DataCite DOIs have different metadata components themselves, or different metadata requirements and options. And then ARKs have a different approach to metadata as well, where you can assign ARKs that have no metadata at all, or you can have, kind of your own custom schema associated with metadata and things like that. So as Andrew said, sort of the standardization of DOIs and the metadata associated with them is really conducive to building web services that take advantage of that metadata. And so again, at NCAR in my organization, we used a lot of DOI metadata-based analytics and automatic metadata ingestion, both for dataset DOIs and publication DOIs. And so the standardization of the metadata and the web services is really fantastic. And so, but that's, I think, again, another interesting characteristic about this space is that because there's many different types of identifiers being used for similar purposes, there's sort of still a kind of a diversity of services available to take advantage of that metadata. So that's, I think, something we're still working towards, and was explicitly planned into year 3 of our proposal, which is, into the next year, of how to instrument identifiers play well with ORCIDs and dataset, other dataset DOIs and software DOIs or software identifiers. So that's another point of emphasis is that many instrument identifiers, in fact, probably all of them, an important aspect of them is they need to be related to others, the other data sets or publications that come from their use.
So any other questions or comments? Yeah, Katie.
Yeah, hi. And I missed the beginning part of the presentation, so I was only able to join in the middle of Q&A. So really appreciated the discussion so far. And if you already addressed this, just feel free to skip it. But curious if the use of non-proprietary services for providing persistent identifiers is something that has come up for you all at all, or this idea of community-controlled kind of infrastructure for PIDs. Just curious if that has come up in any of the work that you all have done or plan to do.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I would also like to hear from other folks on the call if they have thoughts about that. I don't know that we've talked about that a lot. I do think we've talked about considerations for use of identifiers, and one of the important ones is the longevity of a PID system and its sort of robustness, its institutional embeddedness, those kinds of things. So those have come up. We haven't talked a lot about control or community control or sort of community development of PID systems. Things like DataSite, ORCID, these things are, have a sort of nonprofit community aspect to them. So that's I think something we're interested in, taking advantage of and sort of playing into. But we haven't talked about it a whole lot. But others have thoughts about that?
Well, I was just going to say that a kind of near-term next step for our project is we're actually putting together sort of a matrix, a comparison matrix of different PIDs that can be used and are being used for instruments and facilities, and really kind of breaking down all the different characteristics of each one. And I don't know if we have community control or that, that aspect in that matrix right now, but we should certainly add it. So I'm writing a note to capture that. So at least we can see then, which ones have that component of it. Because personally, I agree that's a very important thing to think about.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. That's a good comment. So we do have things like governance structures that we're planning to look at. Are these IDs centralized or non-centralized? Because again, some you can assign in multiple ways. Some you kind of need to go through one venue to get them. So that's a good comment.
All right, thanks, Katie. Yeah. Let's see. Do you want to put your slides, the link to your slides in the chat, just so people have access to that? We're coming towards the end of time, but we do have a few minutes left. Any final thoughts? Adoption of PIDs in general, instrumentation, facilities. Yeah, appreciate your comments so far. Like you said, the next
kind of large scale thing that we're doing, or sort of event, is a workshop in Tallahassee, Florida, in August. So we'll be digging into some of the recommendations that were in Adi's slides and next steps in more detail. And some of the questions that you asked might be good discussion points there. So if you're interested, please contact any of us on the call or through our website.
I'm just putting the link to the presentation in the chat right now.
Great. Yeah, so that's got our website in there,
and there's a link at the end to our page to sort of sign up for information about the project. The report that these slides are based on is also linked there, so you should have access to that. Adi, anything you want to close with?
No, I don't think I have anything else to add. I guess I would just emphasize that this project is very much about building out a community and building out a network so that we can discuss and gain clarity on some really, kind of complicated and nuanced issues. And I think the more people we have participating in those discussions, the more successful the project will be. So please do check out the website and sign up for our mailing list and our Slack channel. And we hope to continue this discussion beyond today as well.